Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we're going to talk about the experience of motherhood, and in particular, motherhood as a journey, a process of individuation. And we know, Joseph and I, that this is a special interest of yours, Lisa. You've been working on this and writing about it and doing workshops on it for easily 10 years, I think.
Yeah, what a coincidence.
And I think you've got a book in the oven about all of this.
I do. I am working on a book about motherhood as an individuation opportunity. So, I guess my story is that I got into training when my daughter was not quite a year old. So I started training when she was just a little over a year old. And then early in training, I had my second child. And so these two things happened very much for me in tandem, motherhood and analytic training, which was wonderful in so many ways. But it meant that I was sort of thinking deeply about my own experience as I went through motherhood, and how it, first occurred to me as I was struggling through, some cold winter day, and I had a baby who was 6 months old, and then I had a 2-year-old, and I was, it was freezing cold, but I think I just got them out of the house for a walk just so I didn't lose my mind. And I thought, God, this is so hard. And I sort of just spontaneously thought, yeah, but I'm really just learning so much about myself. And it was sort of this, it was an aha moment. It's like, wow, this is really I am really growing psychologically. And I don't know that I put it quite in those words.
I remember you talking about it and realizing, maybe it's supposed to be hard.
Huh.
And having that realization, I think lots of mothers do, that it is really hard.
Yeah.
It's much harder than we anticipate. And it certainly is much harder than anything. Not that I've looked at these magazines recently, but I'm thinking of the women's magazines like Family Circle or Reader's Digest, or these things where it's a joy and it's pleasant and it's a privilege, and the stress and the hardship of mothering is really minimized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And can it be that hard? And the answer is yes.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's sort of like the alchemical image of the calcinadio, you get really heated up when you're spending all day, every day, day in, day out with little kids. There's a lot of feeling. There's intense feelings of love. There's intense feelings of anger. There's intense feelings of frustration. There's intense feelings of joy. It all sounds, I suppose, a bit cliched, but it's really true. There's just a ton of feeling, and feeling has this way, the part of the alchemical meaning of the calcinadio is that which is not needed gets burned away, and stuff kind of gets solidified and cooked, and I think that because of these strong feelings that motherhood provokes, it is a kind of psychological cooking process.
And as well as the strong feelings that are evoked, I think we were also talking about the way that being a mother forces you to contain those feelings, that it's the combination of the two things, that just having a lot of feelings or strong feelings may or may not be transformative in and of itself. But the fact that you're raising children and you feel like responsible for that and accountable to it, and you love them.
You try to contain the strong feelings. I think it's fair to say it doesn't always happen.
And I don't think it's supposed to always happen.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, right? Because it's like parents who, like when you get angry at your children, and I think it's, I saw some probably informal, unscientific survey of like parents of 4-year-olds, how often do you yell at your child? And it was like really high, and I was like, oh yeah, 3, 4, yeah, there's a lot of yelling that goes on. And I thought a lot about sort of getting angry at children, and sort of it's obviously not good to lose your shit at your kids, and yet I think it's probably not great if you never do either.
Yeah.
It's
I'm thinking about Donald Winnicott, a British psychoanalyst, and he was a pediatrician and worked with kids, and he came up with a very reassuring phrase that I've offered to my clients of the good enough mother. Not the perfect mother, not the gifted mother, not the, radiant, miraculously gifted mother, but a good enough mother.
Yeah, that's a great phrase.
And I don't know a mother who hasn't totally lost it with her kids. And I know I did. And I've had clients who come in and say, I lose my temper with my kids. I yell at my kids. And sometimes they say, and then I apologize to them, and they struggle with themselves over it. It seems to me that it may be part of the shadow side of motherhood, but it is there.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think, Winnicott, speaking of Winnicott, he has this great essay, I believe it's called Hate and the Countertransference. And he goes through this whole thing about reasons mothers hate their babies or something like that. Yes. It's been a while since I've read it, but it's actually quite funny. Like, one of the things is because she takes him out and he is a perfect darling, and everyone says how cute he is, when half an hour before he was screaming and wailing or something like that. It was all, very relatable stuff. But really what he gets to is, and its relevance to therapy and why he's talking about it is, he says something like, the baby can't feel that you love it unless the baby has felt that you hate it. And there's this sort of analogy with doing therapy, that you have to feel like the person that you're with is authentic. And when we are authentic, we sometimes have aggression toward each other. That's part of what makes for a healthy relationship, is that when something happens, you can find the other person. And I do think it actually would not be good if a parent never got angry at a child, because the child would have no way of knowing that he had found the parent. I mean, we find each other in these kind of moments of context, some of which are loving and some of which are like, hell no, you can't have a popsicle for breakfast. You look quizzical, Joseph.
I'm just curious about the unfolding mystery before me.
Which is? What is the unfolding mystery?
I think this tension between how tight the container for the calcinatio is held, and when does the cork pop out? And when I think about it alchemically, while of course it's reasonable for the cork to pop out, but it does change the nature of the experiment. So I'm holding that on one side, and then I'm holding the fact that the children need to meet a real person in the mother, and not some kind of a self-orchestrated automaton in that way. And the reality is there's a balance around it. That said, for something to be a calcinatio, it does have to be contained, or else it's just a bonfire. So calcinatio is intrinsically a properly contained emotional fire. And that is what causes the suffering that leads to transformation. So I'm just holding that in mind.
Yeah, and I mean, I would definitely say that, the cork pops out. I mean, I think it does for everybody, and
understandably.
And so maybe calcinatio is not actually the right image. But kind of going back to Winnicott for a second, I think one of the things that happens ideally is that when you do lose your cool with your kid, I think what's important there is, and I'm not advocating losing your cool at your kid. I'm just saying, hey, it's going to happen, is repair. And so, because one of the things that we really teach kids significantly when they're toddlers, and then again when they're teenagers, is, the fancy term for it is affect regulation. We teach them how to manage emotions. And some of managing emotions is, what do you do when you didn't manage them very well? And you go back and you say, I'm really sorry, and you make a repair, and you don't say, I'm really sorry, but you made me angry. You say, I'm really sorry. And you take responsibility for it. And then you pick yourself back up and you try to do better the next day. And I think modeling that is important. And I think that in a way, hate is an emotion that connects. It's just the other side of love. And I'm not actually talking about hating your children. I'm talking about, well, so this is my image for that is my son used to say, when he was a toddler, he would say, "I hate you." When I don't know, wouldn't give him dessert or something. And I remember one day just saying, "Well, right now I hate you too."
Mm-hmm.
But an hour later, it was like, "I love you."
Yes,
So
yes.
I'm talking about that kind of hate, not an actual hate, which sometimes some parents feel for their
Right.
children.
We're really just talking about frustration and anger.
Yes.
And that can find its way into all kinds of language.
Right. But there is a lot of eros in that feeling.
Yes.
It's really connected.
It's passionate.
I wouldn't feel that for you if I didn't love you.
And all passionate loves have that.
Yes, of course.
And a good enough mother feels passionate about her children, which is why she gets fierce with them.
Yes.
And we demonstrate and model a full range of emotions.
Right.
The full gamut.
Mm-hmm.
All of it. And when things go awry, we make a repair. And there's stuff written more recently that it's not so much the rupture in the relationship that is really damaging to a child. And I'm talking again about a good enough mother, but what really matters is the repair, that the rupture can be healed, it can be bridged over, it can be, and that's what the apology and taking responsibility does for the child. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. And the mom can say, I really love you, and whatever else she may want to add to that. And there's a repair. And that story by Maurice Sendak of Where the Wild Things, that's the most wonderful story because the little boy is acting like a little beast, and the drawing is of him in a little animal suit. And he's scaring the dog, and his mother finally loses it and calls him a wild thing and sends him to his room, and he goes
with no dinner.
With no dinner, right. And he stomps off in his room, and he has this fantasy of going to the kingdom where there are all these weird, monstrous beings, and
which is an image of like kind of uncontained aggression.
Yes.
Right?
And he masters the wild things. He becomes the king of the wild things. And then all of a sudden, he wants to go back where someone loves him best of all. And so in his fantasy, he sails way across the ocean, and he goes all the way back, and so on and so on and so forth. And he finally gets back to his room, and his supper is there, and it was still hot.
Right.
And, he can trust, despite their rift, that his mother still loves him best of all. And that it's safe to be mad at one another.
Yes. Yes, I think that that's true. I think it's important to learn that it's safe to be angry.
Yes, and that it can be repaired. Yes. There's your supper, and it's still hot.
And in the anger, even if we just use that story, that the mother is still demonstrating emotional regulation, because as angry and frustrated as she is at the child, she simply sends him up to his room. That had she demonstrated a more problematic, unregulated anger, she might have struck him, she may have done any number of much more primitive behaviors. So the fact that she's angry is one thing, and the fact that she delivers it in a way that's still civilized, that's still included a restraint, and the fact that she loved her child is absorbed by the child and is modeled. I'd like to introduce just the idea that, which I think is true, is that there is a kind of shared psychological field between the mother and the child, and there is a way in which the emotional intensity and the emotional skills of the mother and the child are shared in that field, in that unconscious to unconscious communication. So even though in this fairy tale, the mother, scolds him and sends him to bed, but all of this restraint that she has to hold in only delivering that punishment is actually very communicated to the child as well as demonstrated. So even though just as you said, there might be a feeling of, I could just hate my kid right now, but it doesn't come out in that way. It comes out in some other much more temperate way.
Right.
It doesn't come out as archetypal rage.
Unmediated rage.
Yes.
Unmediated and, raise the city, burn the buildings, that kind of uncontrolled forest fire rage.
Although, I mean, when you're in the experience, it can feel like that.
It's blighting.
Yeah, it can, it's pretty dysregulating to see how angry you can get at your own kid.
It's a surprise.
Yeah, it is a surprise. So one of my favorite quotes is by the novelist Faye Weldon. And the quote is, "The best thing about not having children is that you can go on believing that you're a good person."
That humility and the self-knowledge that comes. Yes.
Oh, yes. Because you do things, you do things. You feel levels of feeling and in particular anger that you did not know you were capable of.
Yes. So we encounter our shadows in a very real daily way.
Yes.
Of how angry we can get, how frustrated we can get, how bored we can get.
There's other ways.
It goes on and on.
And on the other side of it, I remember being so moved when my younger sister had her first child. And she said to me, with her eyes just brimming, she said, "I did not know my body was capable of feeling this much love. Like I didn't even know my cells could do that." So it is the broadening in all directions, I think, for mothers.
Definitely. And to talk about the shadow part, I mean, I think there's the way that we find our rage and our anger. And that can be, anger is important. It's important to be able to find your anger. You may need it to protect your kid. So that's a good kind of, harnessing that ability to be in touch with your anger can be very growth promoting. And the other way that it brings up shadow dynamics is that, our kids are going to do some things that are not so pretty. And if we think about it, we might realize that one of the things that gets under our skin about it is it's like parts of ourselves we don't really want to know, Like I remember I was in training and I was preparing for the you have to take these big exams called the propaedeuticum, and I was preparing for those, and I felt really uncertain, and was I going to be able to do this, and had I studied enough, and would I be able to study enough? I felt really, I wasn't sure I was adequate. Okay. And that day I happened to be going up somewhere with the kids in the car, and I got in the car, and there was this little boy riding his bike down the sidewalk, and he looked about to be my daughter's age, and I was like, my daughter's not riding a bike yet, And so I sort of spent some time kind of perseveratively thinking about like, oh no, is she behind developmentally? What's, and all of a sudden I saw what I was doing, right? I was having all this anxiety about whether my daughter was inadequate because she could ride a bike yet. Really, it was about me and my own feelings of inadequacy. And so there are all these times when we're going to see the worst parts of ourselves reflected in our children. And that creates another humility and a chance to accept that content both in our children and in ourselves, with compassion.
I like the word humility. It's similar to the word humus or earth. So there's something about a dose of humiliation and humility that puts us right in the soil that is almost always fertile.
And it does take away from us all those moments of, if you can bring some consciousness to it, that my children are not a reflection of me. How well and how good my children are indicates what a good mother I am, how good a person I am, how aware I am, how capable I am. No, they're their own little people. Their own very distinct people.
Yeah, we have to sort of recognize that they're separate from us, and we have to be willing to let them go.
What does let them go mean to you when you say that?
In some sense, letting go of our kids kind of starts the day they arrive. There's just ways where they're always constantly growing and changing, and And, it happens pretty quickly that they need you less and less, or they need you in different ways. And one of the ways that I think about this is, that I like to frame it is with fairy tales. And one of the fairy tales that's relevant here is the story of Briar Rose. So, this is the Sleeping Beauty tale. And the parents get this prophecy that when she turns 15, she's going to prick her finger on a spinning wheel and fall dead. And then that's kind of changed. Her fate is changed so that she's just going to fall asleep. So what do? They get rid of all it's a spinning wheel, right? Or is it a spindle? They get rid of all the spindles in the kingdom. They're trying to protect her. I mean, 15 is the age when, girls sort of reach sexual maturity, and they're kind of ready to begin to launch. I mean, not so much in our society, but certainly back then. Yeah. So this would be like, no, we don't want her to experience this kind of initiation into adulthood. We want to keep her childlike, right? Well, what happens when that happens? Everyone falls asleep. The entire castle falls asleep. The king and the queen fall asleep. When you don't let your child enter into his or her own life, you become petrified as well. You stop growing too. So for us as parents to continue to grow, we have to release our children to their fate. I mean, in age-appropriate ways and at the right time.
But this confrontation with what the mother or the father simply cannot control. I mean, you have a colicky child, and you apply all the methods that you know to comfort a colicky child, but their digestive system still has to unfold in its own process. So the parent has to cope with that sense of helplessness, and that there are larger processes or ancient processes happening that not all the maternal wisdom in the world can make disappear. So right from the beginning, you're right. There is this accommodation with a larger reality.
Yeah, and you're in touch with your own sense of limitation and your own mortality as well. It really brings it up.
There's a separation, and I think you're right. It starts right away as soon as you bring that baby home from the hospital, where no matter what you do one night, you feed the baby, you change the baby, you hold the baby, you do everything you can think of, and that baby keeps on crying. The challenges are our sense of being in control, of being competent, being successful. And we all want to be successful parents. And like Briar Rose's parents could not tolerate the separation, the initiation, the difference. So there was going to be this enmeshed relationship of, we will take care of you. We will control all the external world factors that could possibly harm you, symbolized by these wicked spindles. But of course, there's always a spindle.
Right. Talking about sort of wanting to be successful. I mean, I think especially motherhood can be especially challenging for mothers who maybe have had a big career out in the world and are used to kind of operating in that way, because being a mother is a different skill set. And there's this really great, I think it's an Algonquin fairy tale that touches on that. It's called Glooskap and the Baby. And Glooskap is this incredible warrior, and he's defeated all these tribes, and he's defeated witches and ogres and everything. He has no rivals, right? So he's boasting about this, and this old woman says, "Oh, I know someone you couldn't beat." And Glooskap says, "Bring him on." And the old woman says, "Are you really sure?" Glooskap says, "Absolutely." So she hands him a baby. And, I think the story goes something like, the baby's over on the floor. Glooskap is like, "Come here." And the baby doesn't. And then the baby starts to cry and cry and cry. And Glooskap can't do anything to make this baby stop crying. And finally he hands the baby back and said, "You're right. I can't do that." But, if we have a sort of heroic out in the world attitude, motherhood's probably going to kind of humble us in that way. There's that term again, humility.
One of the other things that I work with young fathers in my practice a lot, because they're often surprised by the emotional intensity that their children can evoke in them. And one of the things that I try to unpack with them is that the stage of development and the age of the child evokes the developmental stage and the memories of those ages in the parent, good, bad, indifferent. So the parent is plunged back into being 6 years old,
absolutely,
back into being 9 years old. And in that shared field, it is profoundly hot in that way. But realizing that, I think, for young fathers, allows them to kind of shift the locus of interest a little into their own psyches and comforts them greatly.
Well, and in that there is some opportunity for reworking of old wounds.
Hugely.
Yes.
And also because the father's projecting their own unresolved material of being 6 years old onto the child. So it relieves a certain kind of burden in the relationship. And I think the children respond to that. So this idea of all subtle levels of shadow, even in the crying sound of the infant, having a child crying and unsalved in a crib, and does some part of our psyche know that? What that's like in a very, very visceral way.
Definitely.
And which adds another dimension to the suffering that the mother or the father feels.
If that was our experience at that early age too, there's a way that memory is sort of encoded in our body and gets reawakened. But again, it can be so healing to be able to respond differently than your own parent did.
Yes, that soothing that child has a correlate inside to soothing one's own inner child. And so as the child successfully moves to these developmental periods, there's a way in which the parent also is moving through that, and perhaps for another round through it, and maybe in a better way. And I wonder if that's also part of the ripening process that, for instance, young fathers, I think, really feel.
Yeah, I think mothers feel that too. I mean, for mothers, it's often another part of it. And, fathers obviously have their own challenges, but for many mothers, part of it is sort of sorting out this, I have this intense attachment, this child has so many needs. How do I balance my own needs for professional advancement, for friendships, for actualizing different parts of myself with the child? And that obviously can be very tricky, very difficult.
Or how do you just balance your need to have a shower?
To take a shower, right?
Really?
Yeah.
For new mothers, it can be sometimes such a shock that I actually can't even take a shower. That baby is so all-consuming, and the crying of the baby awakens such a need to respond immediately to that, and that there's a way in which I think as mothers, our sense of self is challenged. And our sense of being able to be in control of have our egos direct things as we're used to being able to direct things. That gets challenged. And hopefully, as Jung said, a defeat for the ego is a victory for the self, that we find something over time, we find something deeper, something more real. Something else is undergirding us and the relationship and the process. And it's not just all in our heads. It's not what we want it to be. It's not what we believe it should be. It is something else.
I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the landing of the archetype of the mother. And there's some theory about whether the presence of the child actually draws the archetype of the mother forward, or whether the archetype lands in a woman's psyche as she's moving towards pregnancy or in pregnancy, and how that changes her thoughts and feelings and the wisdom, perhaps even the instinctive wisdom that might come forward, having access to this archetypal root. And when it doesn't happen, actually, is also interesting. I've run into that in my practice, which is really painful.
Yeah. Working with women who didn't feel that.
A couple of women who gave birth and the maternal archetype did not land. And they felt the child was a stranger.
Yes.
Was
that's
kind
really
of
hard.
like, was a terrible misopportunity had happened to them, which was shocking to them.
Well, I'd like to reflect on that for a minute. I'm thinking about the part of the idea of archetypes that is very biological.
Where there's the ultraviolet and the infrared, right?
Of that continuum where we go from the infrared around to a more spiritual place. But pregnancy is very physical. Childbirth is very physical. I know mothers, and I had that experience of I was simply taken over by my body. And then after the birth, again taken over by these massive physical changes and
It's like your body
breastfeeding.
just does these things.
Right. My body took over. It was the physicality and the awakening of this instinctual archetype of motherhood, if you will.
So let me just clarify, because I'm right with you.
My body was doing it.
Right.
It had nothing to do with my ego.
So the infrared ultraviolet thing, and if I'm wrong, correct me here, but what Jung said is that the archetype sort of spans this really broad range, and it goes all the way out to the spiritual side. And I think he said that was the ultraviolet, but it goes right down, rooted into the body and in the instincts, and that was the infrared. And so there's this way that, Joseph, when you talked about the archetype, you waved your hand above your head, and I was thinking, oh hell no, it's right down in the body, that's where the archetype
it's right down literally to your crotch,
up.
which is what happens when you give birth. It's astonishingly physical.
Right. So this is a little graphic, but I remember, and I'm sure you can relate to this too. So there's this thing that happens when your baby cries, your milk lets down.
Yes.
Yep.
And you're sitting there and you're having you're sipping your iced tea or something, and your baby cries, and all of a sudden your shirt's wet.
And talking about the archetype, I've had friends say they're in the supermarket and someone else's baby cries and their milk will let down.
Right. And it's just like, I remember that happening. It's sort of like, oh my God, I'm a mammal.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, I am an animal.
Yes.
I have instincts that like do these things to my body. I was like I don't think many of us are in touch with that on a daily basis, or at least not quite in that way. It was pretty profound.
It's very profound, and there's a ferocity in it that also has joy in it. You're really taken right out of your ego when in the process of giving birth and in the process of breastfeeding and your milk letting down. You're exactly what you said. I'm a mammal. And there's an empowerment and a ferocious joy in it of, look what my body can do. I'm a physical being doing these instinctive and biological functions.
Yes, and when you use the word I'm a mammal, what it evokes is you're in touch with this enormous ancient family of beings that are kind of like every female mammal that's ever given birth or nursed a child is somehow behind you in that moment.
Or to watch animals mother always or parent, I guess you can't always tell, but it's always kind of really profound, because you see, it's that time of year where you see the birds feeding their baby birds, and it's like, wow, man, that takes a ton of work. It's like, wow.
She must be really frustrated.
But Joseph, you said, well, what about when it doesn't happen? And I do have some thoughts about that. I think so. We're kind of talking about being mammals. This whole jig depends on becoming attached, right? And most of the time, the maternal attachment system works well enough. I think that attachment is sort of kindled or encouraged by a couple of things. One is pleasure, and the other is competence. And so when your baby cries and you pick her up and put her to your breast, and she sucks hungrily and is happy, that brings this sense of like, wow, look at that, I did that, And I think that when something gets in the way of that, either, postpartum depression, or if the baby is very difficult to soothe and you don't have a sense of competence, then that sort of starts can kind of start a negative spiral where, because you don't feel competent, you find yourself shying away, which makes you less open to attachment, makes you feel less attached, which then makes it more difficult to comfort the kid. And it can sort of go in this direction that isn't good, And then it's like, I think the clinical work at that point is to sort of help the the parent find that place of competence, kind of mirror the way. I mean, and obviously if there's severe postpartum depression, we're in a whole nother realm.
Yes, of course.
But kind of mirroring like, no, you did that well. And, look at that, and sort of helping them feel more competent. And the other thing is pleasure. I mean, we're supposed to enjoy our children. It's supposed to be fun. And a lot of the time it is. I always like to say that my children are, either filling me with joy or making me feel like I want to bury them in the backyard, So, it's the playfulness, which starts, pretty early on when they can smile at you and then you can tickle them, and it's playing. Play is an attachment behavior.
Mm.
And so you enjoy them, you enjoy how adorable they are. And that is what kind of, kindles what you're calling kind of the mothering archetype. But really, I'm thinking about it as just this very complicated neurobiological thing where we attach.
I know what you're saying is true, but I think that if we're staying in a Jungian frame, to leave that alone for a moment and to really speculate about the kind of spiritual pattern of the mother that also has its own independent presence and is recognizable when it manifests, that is that incredible ephemeral visitation that happens that may or may not be related to biology. I think when we think of the classic Jungians and the classic Jungian attitudes, there was less of a focus on the biology than we have now with all of the different kinds of research out. And it really was a spirituality. And it leans me into Brian Feldman's work on the aesthetics of motherhood as a way of tracking the incarnation of the archetype. And I don't know that I'm a fully competent apologist for his work, but my sense of it is that if one were to observe the mother and infant or mother and child dynamic, that when the mother archetype is present in its positive way, that it actually evokes a sense of beauty in those who are present to it.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's lacking, if that subtle countertransference response is not presence, we might speculate that the mother archetype is not landing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of his experiments were to coach mothers into some of the aesthetics of mothering, which could involve play. It could involve beholding the child or enjoying the child in various ways as a way of seeing if the archetype could be constellated in the mother as a kind of spiritual force. And I think as Jungians, that also is valid.
And that goes back to what Lisa was saying about the infrared and the ultraviolet, which was Jung's image for those opposite ends of a spectrum that also somehow mysteriously connect, of the earthiness and the biology of mothering and the spiritual dimension as well.
The other thing that opens up is the idea that the spirit of the mother could at times incarnate in a man.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sure.
Which, if it's tied explicitly to biology, makes no sense at all. But this was an interesting tension that Robert Bly talked about in his work in Iron John and in the men's movement, is that he felt that what young men were needing were male mothers, which is a way of introducing this idea of the mother archetype inside of a male mentor.
Mm-hmm.
And if we imagined that, what would that be like? And he tried to model that idea of soft, sustaining, nurturing of men between men.
I'm wondering if that is mothering or if that is fathering, and both have different aspects of nurturing.
It did, but
it may
I
not
think
be the same.
Yeah, this is where Jungians always get lost in the weeds. Is this whole sort of gender stuff. I mean, it's very, I don't know that we've ever really found a very satisfactory way. I don't know that I'm tying this so directly to biology, because I think what I am saying is that this is all about attachment, and men can attach to infants just like women can. So it's not like, well, I birthed the baby, so therefore I'm the mother. It's more, I mean, I think that the attachment stuff is really profound, and there is a real spiritual element to it, absolutely. But there is a biological element too. It's both.
Of
That's
course.
all.
And,
Yes, it is.
and I'm thinking, of course, men and women attach, and men and women can both nurture. But what I was thinking about is the work of Kwame Scruggs, who works with young African American men, and they use myth and drumming and storytelling and sharing, and it is very nurturing. But I wouldn't call it mothering. It has a different feeling tone, a different quality of nurturance that brings young men into themselves and also sort of can help them launch in the world. So it's just a slightly different age from what we've been talking about, too. We've been talking about mostly young children and infants.
You know, I want to say one more thing about sort of this, like when it doesn't happen and that sort of thing, because I have a couple thoughts about it. First of all, I think that there's a lot put culturally on mothers in our society. Like you were saying before, Deb, that, you know, it's supposed to be easy and wonderful and we're supposed to love it, right? And so there's sort of all these expectations about the experience and about the role. And in some sense, those just sort of balloon every year. And so that's part of why I like to talk about getting, you know, losing your shit with your kids, because most people won't talk about that, you know? And the other thing is I want there to be room for women who don't come to that, oh, I just love my baby place easily, to find a way to enter the conversation and have their experience mirrored too. So in other words, you know, while I do think that there are some extreme cases of people who just don't find that connection, and that can be a really painful thing to live with, because it's hard to talk about. But I guess I want to try to normalize that it's difficult, and that there might be different ways to grow into that attachment, and that we could sort of widen the range of what could be okay.
I think that's a really important point. It's not like turning on a light, and that, you know, right after that baby is born, you're necessarily filled with, you know, all kinds of warm, glorious feelings. I remember right after I had twins, and right after my first baby was born, a nurse came up to me and said, Mother, and she wanted to show me the first baby. And I didn't know who she was talking to. Who are you? Oh, she means me. Oh my goodness. Well, that's, so it took some time. I remember looking at my two babies and going, you know, how did this happen? Well, of course, I knew very well how it had happened, but I really didn't know who they were, and that there is a process of attachment. It doesn't just, you know, arrive postpartum on a magic vehicle of some sort.
Well, perhaps we can switch to a dream. This dream comes to us from a listener who's male and 50 years old, and he is an IT professional. And here's the dream. I was visiting the home of a friend who doesn't exist in the real world. She lives with her mother in a house near woods in another state. She's very talkative and a good friend, but is ill and can't work. We hung around the house and laughed and talked. Can't recall what about. Shared history, I guess. I was sure that this was not my first visit, and we've known each other a long time. To stress again, the person in my dream is nobody I've ever met in life. We connected well, but I had to go. I wanted to call her, but didn't have a phone number. She said she'd email me. I woke with a sense of confusion that my friend didn't actually exist. And context of the dream, the dreamer writes, getting older and my kids are finishing school, which is stressful for my wife and I. And what were the main feelings in the dream? Happiness at the time spent and the transitoriness of it.
So if I rest imaginatively into the dream, and even with a bit of information, I would imagine this 50-year-old guy, where he is in life. And I think of finding an old friend that I had forgotten or forgot that I knew, that they'd known each other for a long time, somewhere in this inner world in the woods, and the pleasure at becoming reacquainted with a friend. That's there's a sweetness and a pathos to it, because she's here, but she's also ill and she's disabled, but she's my friend, and that feeling of, gosh, I don't know how it could be that I would have forgotten that I had this friend. And what are the parts of the soul that a man comes to as his children are launching and he is transitioning out of that stage of fatherhood, and the libido is free to go into the inner worlds and to be reacquainted. There's something very soft and sweet about the whole story for me.
It's really poignant.
That is exactly
touching.
the word that I had in mind. It's this very poignant dream that seems just so emblematic of what Jung talked about in the second stage of life, which is the journey inward. That the first half of life is about ego development and going out in the world and being a parent and working and whatever career or careers you may have, and doing things out there in the external world. And now his children are leaving home, and he hears an inner figure, a woman, and it's all right there. She's ill, but they laugh and they talk, and it's shared history. And it's a very real friendship. So it's an inner relationship with what you might call an anima, the inner opposite. And it's someone other. It's not a part of him. It's somebody that he knows, somebody that he doesn't know. It's very poignant and touching.
It is. And if I imagine that this is the beginning of a fairy tale, what I would imagine is what she could be ill with is that she still lives with her mother. And in a man's psyche, when the anima and the mother are not well differentiated, there's a problem. There's a tension in the psyche.
Some libido that's trapped there, that's stopped up.
Yes, and that a man often cannot give himself into the fullness of the relationship with the anima if she partakes too much of the mother, because that's a totally different dynamic. Without knowing him, my fantasy would be that as he continues to engage the friend in the imaginative world, that there might be some opportunity for her to become her own separate person, and would that resolve her illness? I'd be curious about that.
Yeah, and the friend lives in the woods, and often woods and forest are symbols for the unconscious. I think there's a hopefulness here, because even though the dream ego, the sense of I in the dream, says, I have to go, I wanted to call her. She said she would email me. She said she would be in touch. So something is alive in the unconscious that wants to connect.
But he doesn't have a phone number.
No, he doesn't have a phone number. So this is the life of the unconscious reaching up and out. And it's not something that the ego can manage, which is, again, sort of emblematic of the second stage of life, of what's going on inside. And getting a relationship more in place with the unconscious and with whatever unfinished business you may have inside, given a productive first half of life in which you have done the work of ego development.
I want to tie in something that you brought up about the fact that the anima is going to send an email to him, and he's an IT professional. So what it might mean that the anima can speak his language in that way, and or what it may mean that the anima may demand his presence in order to visit her again. That whatever it's done to shape his psyche to be an IT person may have to be set aside. In our world of connectivity and emails and telephone calls and FaceTiming, that often replaces a certain kind of face-to-face intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end of the dream, when there's this little block about staying in touch through technology, at the end, it's not quite so easy whether she can reach him or how he's going to reach her, that the solution he doesn't come to at the end of the dream, but he might in afterthought is, I guess I'm going to have to really go there again.
Yes. Yeah.
I can't rely on the part of my personality that's mercurial and facile with technology. I may need to approach this through the sensate function, or through a different function where my body arrives back into the woods in order to have this conversation.
It's not only in the woods, it's in another state.
No,
There's
nice.
a wonderful pun there.
Yes,
you know,
it's a different state of consciousness,
Exactly.
a different state of mind.
State of
exactly.
You know, one of the things that I found really moving about this dream is this image of the friend that's always been there that we have forgotten about. It's sort of the kind of inner companion, the way that we can forget that we are companioned by the unconscious. And it's we can stop listening to our dreams and sort of put them aside, and then realize that, oh, the dreams are still there. I still have that inner companion, you know, and
that she has been sharing his experiences.
Yes, shared history,
regardless of whether or not they're talking.
Yeah, there's something elusive about that, but then also she's always there.
And I remember way back when I was first reading some of Jung, and that I read about the inner companion. And it was some piece where he didn't say what the inner companion was. And I remember thinking, oh, I wonder what that is, and how could I get one? You know? And so here is this dreamer who has an inner companion. And when I first went into analysis and worked with dreams for I don't know how long, but some good solid period of time, it was quite a while before I connected with, oh my goodness, something is in touch with me. Something is coming to me that's me and not me, and it's impossible to define. But here's this dream, and this man has an inner companion. She's talkative, and they laugh, and they have shared history. There's the inner companion. There's something really lovely about it.
So if I were working with this person, I would definitely say, you should go home and do an active imagination and go visit her again.
Oh, yes.
Right?
It would be a shame not to go back to the woods. It just would be such a shame.
Yeah. This is a dream. This dream is a gift. It's a real gift of inner life. And by all means, go back to the house in the woods and visit her again in your imagination. Because at the end, when he says, I woke with a sense of confusion that my friend didn't actually exist.
But she
really
yes,
she does.
Yes. Exactly.
I think I just came across a quote from Jung saying, you know, the thing that people still don't fully grasp, I'm paraphrasing, fully grasp about me is that I believe that the psyche is absolutely real.
Yeah.
That I'm not speaking in metaphors.
Yeah. Yes. That's great.
That's great. Here it is for this dreamer. So,
Joseph, would you like to say a word about Paja?
I would.
Okay.
And we would like to let you know and remind you that all three of us are faculty members at the C.G. Jung Institute in Philadelphia. And the Institute offers a Jungian seminar that meets once a month, as well as public programs. If you're interested, we'd love for you to send us an email at thisjungianlife@gmail.com or go to the website at cgjungphiladelphia.org. And hopefully we'll see you there.
Until next time.
Keep living this Jungian life.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.